On February 6, 1952, King George VI died and Elizabeth became queen. She was 25 years old. Her first crisis wasn't the Cold War or the Commonwealth or Churchill. It was her mother, who refused to leave the house. The king had spent February 5th at Sandringham without incident. Accounts gathered after his death describe a peaceful day. He went out shooting on the estate. The pheasants flushed, the guns fired, the gamekeepers retrieved. A day so ordinary that those who were there would later mention it specifically, the way people remember the last unremarkable Tuesday before everything changed. He was in good spirits that evening. He retired at his usual hour, and sometime during the night, his heart stopped. Coronary thrombosis, the medical record would confirm. At approximately 7:30 in the morning of February 6th, his valet, James MacDonald, came to wake him and found him dead in his bed. The specific image that produces a man lying still in a cold February bedroom in Norfolk, the curtains perhaps not yet drawn, the stillness of a house that doesn't yet know what it is, belongs to MacDonald alone. No account tells us what he did in the 30 seconds after he understood what he was looking at, whether he stood there for a moment or retreated immediately to find another member of staff. The protocols that followed were meticulous. The moment before them was private, brief, and contained only one witness. MacDonald found the king. Then he told someone. And then the machinery of royal mourning, which has existed in recognizable form for centuries and which practices itself constantly, began to move. Sandringham House, Norfolk. A Wednesday in February, the grounds still bare and cold, the skeletons of winter trees against a gray sky. The king's bedroom, an ordinary room in an extraordinary house, sealed now by the fact of what had happened in it. Sir Alan Tommy Lascelles, private secretary to George VI and in a matter of hours to his successor, was asked to break the news to the widow. He was a precise, formidable man who had served the royal family across 3 decades. He had navigated the abdication crisis, managed 2 sovereigns, and understood the machinery of the institution as well as anyone alive. Walking to that room, to tell a woman that her husband of 28 years had died in his sleep, wasn't a task the machinery could perform. That part was just a man and a door. An equerry named Ford was dispatched to inform Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Queen Mary, the king's mother. Churchill, who had known George VI through 6 years of war and 5 years of peace, was reportedly so overcome he sat in silence for some minutes. Queen Mary, 84 years old and in fragile health, received the news and composed herself with the discipline of a woman who had outlived her husband, her eldest son's kingship, and now a second son. Within Sandringham House, the household was already orienting itself around an absence. 4,000 miles away in Kenya, a different sequence was unfolding, slower, less rehearsed, and in some ways more difficult because there were no protocols to follow. Only a young woman and news. Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip had flown to Kenya as part of a Commonwealth tour that George VI had been too ill to undertake himself. He had stood on the tarmac at London Airport on January 31st, in the cold, against his doctor's advice, because he wanted to see his daughter off, and waved as her plane climbed. His left lung had been removed the previous autumn. The people around him could see he wasn't well. He waved anyway, and she watched him from the window as the plane pulled away, and that was the last time she saw him. They had arrived at the Treetops Hotel, a structure built 35 feet up in a giant fig tree above a waterhole in the Aberdare forest. It was less a hotel than a platform. Rough timber, a viewing gallery above the canopy, the waterhole below bringing elephants and buffalo and rhino and everything else the African savanna sends to drink at dusk. Elizabeth had spent the night up there watching animals. The kind of night that feels, afterward, both impossibly mundane and desperately significant. At some point during those dark hours, while she observed elephants moving through the undergrowth below a tree she was sleeping in, she became Queen of the United Kingdom without knowing it. Philip's secretary, Mike Parker, a naval officer who had served with Philip in the war and remained one of his closest friends, received the telephone call from Elizabeth's assistant private secretary, Martin Charteris, sometime in the early afternoon local time. The news was already hours old by the time it reached Kenya. Parker understood immediately what it meant and what he had to do. He would say later that informing Philip was one of the hardest things he ever did. He found Philip having a siesta, woke him, and told him. Philip sat with it for a moment. Then he went to his wife. What Philip said when he found her isn't preserved in any document made public. What is recorded is the after, Elizabeth walking away from the rest of the party to be alone for a moment, then returning composed. Charteris drove from the Outspan Hotel to join them. It's the kind of moment about which the only available praise is that she bore it like a queen, because she had, quite literally, just become one. By midday, the new Queen of the United Kingdom was preparing to fly home. At 11:15 that morning, the BBC broadcast from Sandringham. The king was dead. Elizabeth and Philip landed at London Airport on February 8th, 2 days after the death. 2 days of travel and arrangements, and the beginning of whatever she would have to become. They drove to Clarence House, their home since 1949, the residence they had moved into after their marriage, the house where Philip had overseen the renovation and Elizabeth had raised their 2 children. Charles was 3, Anne was 18 months old. Contemporary newspaper coverage, a San Mateo Times dispatch from February 16, 1952, among others, confirmed what the separate household arrangements already implied. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret were at Buckingham Palace. Elizabeth was at Clarence House. The question of what would happen next wasn't administrative. It was constitutional. And the constitutional answer wasn't ambiguous. The question was whether anyone was going to enforce it. Buckingham Palace isn't a family home. That distinction sounds simple. What it actually means takes a moment to establish, because the script of the next 15 months depends entirely on understanding it. Legally, the palace is owned by the reigning monarch in right of the crown. It isn't personal property, which can be inherited or willed from one generation to the next. It isn't crown estate, which the government manages separately. It's an occupied royal palace, a specific constitutional category, held in trust for the office of sovereign, accessible only to whoever holds that office. The palace became the principal royal residence in 1837, when Queen Victoria moved in, and every sovereign since has occupied it as the administrative headquarters of the monarchy. It's 775 rooms, including 19 staterooms, 52 principal bedrooms, the ball suites where heads of state are received, and the formal state apartments where the business of government is conducted, exist to support a working sovereign. Ambassadors present their credentials there. Prime ministers arrive at Buckingham Palace for their weekly audience. The symbolic weight of the building is indistinguishable from the constitutional functions it houses. The Queen couldn't effectively perform those functions from anywhere else. The moment George VI died, that building passed to Elizabeth. His widow acquired no claim to it at his death. Her 15 years in residence, as Queen Consort, as the woman who had held court there, seen it bombed during the Blitz and endured its wartime austerity, created no residual entitlement. In the constitutional framework, those years were her husband's tenure. When his reign ended, so did her right to occupy his house. The arrangement for what came next was equally established. Clarence House, a 4-story Grade 1 listed building on the Mall, adjacent to St. James's Palace, had been Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip's London home since their marriage. The Royal Collection Trust is explicit about this in its own historical record. Clarence House was the London home of Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh from their marriage until her accession as Queen in 1952. The sequence was understood, and had been understood for years. The heir lives at Clarence House, she becomes Queen, she moves to Buckingham Palace, the Dowager moves into Clarence House. Everyone involved knew this sequence. The Queen Mother had lived at the center of the royal institution for a quarter-century. She had helped navigate the abdication, manage the wartime monarchy, and absorbed every protocol and precedent the system had produced. She knew exactly how the residential transition was supposed to work. She had also watched it happen before, or something very like it. When Edward VII died in 1910, his widow, Queen Alexandra, faced the identical transition. The New York Times ran a headline that year, "Alexandra stays on." Alexandra had also lingered at Buckingham Palace rather than vacate promptly for the new King George V and Queen Mary. The pattern of a dowager queen clinging to precedents wasn't an accident in 1952. It was a known historical template, recognized enough to have made newspaper headlines 42 years earlier. The Queen Mother had spent her adult life at the center of the royal family. She knew exactly what the pattern was, which makes the 1952 behavior more deliberate, not less. The biographies note something else about Alexandra's delay. Queen Mary had chafed at it. She needed to access her jewels, her apartments, her proper place in the building she was now entitled to occupy. She didn't make a scene. She waited. The pattern of patient deference in the face of a predecessor's lingering had its own precedent. Both women, the one who stayed too long and the one who waited, were following scripts that the institution had, in some sense, already written. In 1952, the same play was performed again, except now the one waiting was 25 years old, and the one staying was her mother. She stayed for 15 months, February 6, 1952, to mid-May 1953. Every week of those 15 months, Buckingham Palace, the official administrative headquarters of the reigning sovereign of the United Kingdom, was occupied by a woman whose right to be there had ended on the first day. The documented behavior across that period is specific, and the specificity is what matters. William Shawcross's 2009 authorized biography of the Queen Mother, for which he was granted unrestricted access to her personal papers, letters, diaries, and hundreds of hours of tape-recorded interviews she made in her final years with Sir Eric Anderson at Prince Charles's instigation, draws on an archive of extraordinary depth. It runs to 1,096 pages. Accounts drawn from this material describe a woman who was, in the language of sources built on it, desperate to stay in Buckingham Palace. She wrote what multiple sources characterize as impassioned letters to her daughter, expressing the wish to remain. She didn't begin the process of moving her household to Clarence House. She didn't direct her staff to start cataloging and crating and preparing the rooms she had occupied for 15 years. She stayed, and she waited, and she wrote letters. Her stated view of Clarence House was documented and specific. She called it small and horrid. She called it loathsome. These weren't private asides buried in a diary. They were communicated to staff through correspondence in the kind of remarks that travel through a household and accumulate into institutional record. The London Review of Books, reviewing Shawcross's subsequent volume of the Queen Mother's selected letters, noted the phrase she apparently used to describe her own continued presence in the palace during this period. "You would hardly know I was there." She knew she was overstaying. She acknowledged it with light irony. She acknowledged it and stayed anyway. The LRB reviewer, Rosemary Hill, placed this in context of what the Queen Mother decided in those months. She decided that she wouldn't go quietly, if indeed at all. That isn't a sympathetic construction placed over ambiguous evidence. It's a description of documented choices made by a specific person with documented consequences. In letters written to Queen Mary in the immediate aftermath of George VI's death, drawn from Shawcross's archival work, the Queen Mother described her grief with frank precision, writing of how impossible it was to grasp what had happened, and of her worry for Lilibet, so young to carry such a burden. And then she made that burden larger. The grief was real. Letters from the same period describe someone genuinely shattered by loss, a woman who continued talking and laughing and listening while feeling that something essential in her had gone with him. They also describe someone who continued functioning, making decisions, acquiring property, all while writing impassioned letters in defense of her right to a building she had no right to occupy. That simultaneity is the central fact of 1952. She was grieving. She was also, at the same time, doing something else. Both things were happening in the same person, in the same weeks, and the evidence does not resolve the tension between them. It simply records both. While declining to vacate Buckingham Palace, the Queen Mother also purchased the Castle of May. The castle sits on the northernmost tip of the Scottish mainland, a crumbling 16th-century structure at the very edge of the country, as far from London as it is possible to be while remaining on British soil. She had seen it from the road during a period of retreat to Scotland, stopped on impulse, decided to buy it, and began the years-long work of restoration. The purchase is documented in the same year as the Buckingham Palace standoff. A woman who found the logistics of relocating her household to Clarence House apparently insurmountable, found the logistics of acquiring and beginning to restore a medieval castle on the far coast of Scotland entirely manageable. Stephen Tennant, one of her contemporaries, offered a portrait that Hugo Vickers quotes in his 2005 independent biography, 17 Years in the Researching, that captures the combination that so many people found disorienting. She looked everything that she wasn't: gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity, cool, well-bred, remote. Behind this veil she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. Harold Nicholson had called her the greatest queen since Cleopatra. Cecil Beaton had called her a marshmallow made on a welding machine. These descriptions aren't contradictory. They are angles of view on the same object. Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher and historian, dined with the Queen Mother in 1959 and wrote about it afterward with characteristic precision. He found her not indeed particularly intelligent, nor even terribly nice, but a very strong personality, much stronger than he had expected, and filled with the possibility of unexpected answers. This is the woman who had written to Queen Mary that she couldn't bear to think of her daughter, so young, bearing such a burden. And she was in that building for 15 months after writing it. The public, in 1952, knew none of this. They saw a widow in mourning. They saw an older woman stepping aside graciously for a younger one. They saw the perfect tableau of the royal family in seamless transition. The new queen, young and composed. The Queen Mother, dignified and bereaved. The Sunday newspapers ran photographs, the correspondence between the two women, the impassioned letters, the requests, the reported characterizations, remained behind closed doors that wouldn't open fully for decades. Now let us establish what Clarence House actually was. The house was built between 1825 and 1827 to a design by John Nash, the same architect who designed Regent Street and remodeled Buckingham Palace itself. 4 stories, pale render facing, Grade 1 listed on the National Heritage List. positioned on the Mall with green space directly in front, and Lancaster House visible across Stableyard Road, adjacent to St. James's Palace through a shared courtyard wall. Its royal history is long. The Duke of Clarence, the future William IV, commissioned it and chose it over the cramped Tudor buildings of St. James's when he became king in 1830. The same preference the Queen Mother would later claim in reverse. When William IV moved to Buckingham Palace and retained Clarence House as his working office, he had John Nash construct a direct passageway between the two buildings. They have been architecturally connected ever since. The house suffered serious bomb damage during the Blitz of 1940 and 1941. By 1942, after Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, died there, the Red Cross and St. John Ambulance Brigade converted it into their wartime headquarters. When the war ended, it required significant work, not merely decoration, but structural repair from the bombing. That work was done. By 1947, it was habitable. Philip took an active role in the renovation. This was going to be his family's home, and he approached it as such. He had furniture brought from naval quarters, made decisions about the layout of rooms, oversaw the creation of something that functioned as an actual private household rather than a ceremonial address. By June 1949, the renovation was complete and the family moved in. The rooms that had been stripped by the Red Cross were furnished again. A nursery was established. Princess Anne was born there in August 1950. The house accommodated the heir to the throne, the Duke of Edinburgh, 2 children, and their full domestic and secretarial staff for nearly 3 years without apparent difficulty. This is the building the Queen Mother called small and horrid. The Royal Collection Trust describes Clarence House as one of the largest private houses in London. Not a modest property, not a suburban dwelling reassigned to an inconvenient widow. A substantial, recently renovated, Grade 1 listed building in the center of London, adjacent to 2 palaces, with a view of the Mall and the green expanse of St. James's Park. The sort of property that, offered to almost anyone else in Britain, would be understood as an extraordinary privilege. The modifications required to prepare it for the Queen Mother in 1952 cost £10,800. That is the complete documented figure. Not a large renovation, not structural repair, not emergency remediation of some discovered inadequacy. Modifications. The kind of reconfiguration and redecoration that attends any transition of a significant household from one occupant to another. The house where Elizabeth and Philip had raised their children was, with £10,800 of work, considered ready for a Queen Mother. Now compare the 2 buildings directly. Buckingham Palace, 775 rooms, 19 staterooms, 52 principal bedrooms, a ballroom used for investitures and state banquets, a throne room, a picture gallery, a garden that covers 40 acres, the largest private garden in London, staff quarters, administrative offices, kitchens, and the full infrastructure of a working constitutional monarchy. It isn't a house. It's a small city organized around a single symbolic function. Against that benchmark, yes, Clarence House is smaller. It's a house, even a grand one. Even one of the largest private houses in London is still a house. The Queen Mother had spent 15 years occupying something categorically different. She had held court there. She had been photographed on its balcony during the VE Day celebrations, standing beside Churchill, the crowd below 20 stories deep in every direction. She had refused to leave it during the Blitz and drawn strength from that refusal. The building was woven into her public identity in a way that Clarence House, however elegant, however comfortable, was never going to be. What she objected to, the behavioral record suggests, was a reclassification. Clarence House wasn't Buckingham Palace. It didn't carry the symbolic weight, the scale, or the position at the center of national life that she had occupied for a decade and a half. Moving there meant accepting what she couldn't otherwise be forced to accept: that her husband was dead, that her daughter was queen, and that she was, in the title she described in a 1953 letter to her daughter as a horrible name, the Queen Mother. She hated the title. She hated the house. She stayed for 15 months in the place that still made her something other than those things, while she worked out how to become, on her own terms, what she was going to be next. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was 25 years old. She had 2 children under 4. She had just become sovereign of the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and a collection of territories that together comprised the largest empire ever administered under one crown, even in the act of its dissolution. She had known this was coming. It had been coming for years, as her father's health deteriorated. But knowing and experiencing aren't the same thing. She was also constitutionally one of the most powerful people in the country. She could receive her prime minister. She could prorogue parliament. She held the theoretical authority to dismiss her government, appoint her bishops, create her peers. She held the formal standing to walk into Buckingham Palace and tell her mother, in unambiguous terms, that it was time to go. She didn't. The documented record of Elizabeth's response to the standoff is notable primarily for what it doesn't contain. No direct order, no ultimatum, no formal communication from the new queen commanding her mother to vacate a building the Constitution required her to vacate. What the archival record contains, as far as public documentation reveals, is an absence where a directive might have been. The impassioned letters came from her mother, not from her. The reported characterization of the situation, attributed to Elizabeth in a Time magazine account from the year of the Queen Mother's 100th birthday, ran, "Oh no, we couldn't possibly do without Mummy." That is the posture she adopted. Not, "My mother has no constitutional right to remain in a building that belongs to my office, and she needs to leave so I can run the country from it." The posture was its reverse. The Queen couldn't do without Mummy. Mummy was indispensable. The woman who had just become sovereign of the United Kingdom couldn't possibly manage without the person who wasn't leaving her house. Whether or not Elizabeth believed that framing, she enacted it. And the enactment had consequences that ran for the next 50 years. A 1952 Australian newspaper dispatch, reporting on the new Queen's living arrangements in the days following her accession, noted that while Buckingham Palace was considered the appropriate official residence, it was probable that she will continue to live at Clarence House. The public conversation about where the Queen would actually live reflected a real institutional uncertainty, and that uncertainty persisted because nothing was forcing a resolution. Palace advisors of the period had their own institutional reasoning for Elizabeth's restraint. Any suggestion the Queen Mother was being hurried out of her home, a recently widowed woman, barely a month out from her husband's death, the nation still in mourning, would have been, as one account frames it, highly damaging. The monarchy depended, in February 1952, as in every other month, on an image of family unity, warmth, and dignified continuity. The new queen, pushing her bereaved mother out of her home, however constitutionally justified, would have played disastrously in the press. It would have undercut the atmosphere of steady transition that the coronation narrative required. It would have put Elizabeth in the position of appearing, whatever the constitutional reality, to act against her grieving mother. So she didn't appear to act. She went to Clarence House, she opened the boxes, received the red boxes, started working. She attended her father's lying in state. She navigated the first weeks of a reign that would last 70 years. And across the corridor, or rather across London, her mother remained in the building that was now hers. Churchill had been the one, at the outset, who insisted Elizabeth move from Clarence House to Buckingham Palace in the first place. Elizabeth and Philip had been content at Clarence House. It was their home. Their children were settled there. Philip had put years of work into it. Churchill had insisted, on constitutional grounds, that the monarch had to occupy the palace. Elizabeth acquiesced. She moved. And Churchill's insistence on constitutional propriety in one direction, the Queen must live at Buckingham Palace, wasn't matched immediately by equivalent insistence in the other direction. The building could be constitutionally required of Elizabeth without the same constitutional logic being applied to the woman already in it. Philip wasn't a neutral presence in this period. He had not wanted to move to Buckingham Palace and had said so. He was, by multiple accounts, a man of progressive instincts who found the Victorian ceremonial formality of his new official residence frustrating. His mother-in-law found his instincts threatening and his attitude toward modernization destabilizing. The friction between them was documented across the period by people who were present for it. The most specific recorded clash came from the telephone dispute. In the 1950s, after the family was at Buckingham Palace, Philip installed telephones, removing the footmen who had traditionally carried messages between royals within the building. For an institution that ran on personal service and hierarchical ritual, this wasn't a minor change. Biographer Robert Lacey described the Queen Mother's reaction and her fundamental orientation in a single, compressed judgment. There she was, unashamedly harking back to when Britain had an empire. Charming, aristocratic, frankly snobbish, no pretense of actually living in the 20th century. She objected to the phones the way she had objected to Clarence House, as a reclassification of what she was and what the family around her was becoming. Royal biographer Christopher Warwick, drawing on documentary material from the period, offered a direct characterization of the Queen Mother's psychological state in 1952. She felt they'd been cut off in her prime. She loved the position of being queen, and suddenly all that was taken from her. The Queen Mother minded very much being Queen Mother, and she was jealous of her daughter having become queen. Jealous is a strong word. It appears in commentary, not in the Queen Mother's own letters. And her letters, as Shawcross's archive makes clear, were careful documents. She knew they would be read, eventually, by someone beyond the recipient. What they show is grief and warmth, and occasional flashes of the sharpness that Berlin noticed at dinner. What they don't show, or what the available selections don't show, is the bottom of the well. The impassioned letters about Buckingham Palace are described by sources drawing on the archive, but not quoted directly in what is publicly available. The content is known in outline. The specific wording hasn't been released. Elizabeth navigated between her mother and her husband, between the institution's constitutional demands and her own instinct for accommodation, without, as far as the documented record reveals, choosing either fully. The person who finally ended the standoff was Winston Churchill. In early May 1953, approximately 15 months after George VI's death, and roughly 5 weeks before the scheduled coronation on June 2nd, Churchill communicated something to the Queen. The precise content hasn't been made public, that documentary accounts describe as having infuriated the Queen Mother. By mid-May 1953, she had moved. The coronation context explains the timing with a precision the rest of the calendar doesn't. June 2nd, 1953 was immovable. It had been announced, prepared, and scheduled. Every foreign head of state, every Dominion prime minister, every member of the Commonwealth who would attend had been invited months before. The logistics were enormous. The procession route, the Abbey's seating arrangements, the rehearsals that required the actual space of Buckingham Palace for coordination. State dinners were scheduled in the weeks surrounding the ceremony. International guests required accommodation in and around the building. The full machinery of a coronation, the first ever televised as it turned out, watched by 27 million people in Britain alone, couldn't be managed around a competing household occupying the same building. May was, effectively, the constitutional deadline that February had failed to create. Churchill appears to have communicated it in those terms. He was 78, had served 3 monarchs, had known the Queen Mother across the entire arc of the reign she was now grieving the end of, and had the personal authority and the political standing to deliver a message that the Queen had not delivered herself. His insistence that the coronation calendar required the palace to function as the working residence of the reigning sovereign, beginning immediately, not eventually, was the thing that finally moved her. The word finally appears in multiple accounts of the move. Vanity Fair, in its coverage, the Queen Mother, her exquisite art collection, and her daughter, Princess Margaret, finally moved into Clarence House in May 1953. That word isn't neutral. Contemporary accounts understood what the qualifier meant, a transition that had taken a very long time and that required outside pressure to complete. She brought everything. Her art collection, extensive and personally curated, including works by painters she had supported before the rest of the world caught up, was transported and rehung. Her staff came with her. Princess Margaret, who would stay at Clarence House until her marriage in 1960, when she moved to Kensington Palace, made the same crossing. The Queen Mother arrived at a house she had called loathsome, took stock of what had been done to it, and proceeded to make it, over the following years, the most hospitable address in London. The settlement surrounding the move wasn't without cost to the Crown. Churchill, that November, lobbied for a law to be amended allowing the Queen Mother to stand in for Elizabeth II on official duties when the Queen was abroad, a direct concession of ceremonial relevance in exchange for the residential one. The Civil List Act of 1952, which had been passed in the period of transition, had already established her income at £249,000 per year. The Clarence House modifications of £10,800 had been publicly funded. She retained Birkhall on the Balmoral estate as her Scottish base. She was building the Castle of May. She gave up the building. She didn't give up much else. She would live at Clarence House from 1953 until her death on March 30th, 2002. 49 years in the house she had called loathsome. The household she built there became, over the decades, one of the more exuberantly hospitable in London. Her equerry, Ash Wyndham, described it with the slightly exhausted affection of someone who had lived through it. There were wall-to-wall guests. It was exhausting work, but she was a terrific hostess, and she did like her food. She would scrutinize the menu every day and talk to the chef. The guest lists ranged from the Sitwells to Cecil Beaton to Noel Coward to Ted Hughes, with whom she eventually negotiated to split the poet laureate's traditional sherry allowance. She entertained with the enthusiasm of someone who had found, in the much-resented smaller house, a stage she could command completely on her own terms. She bought racehorses and backed them aggressively at Ascot. She wrote to her treasurer at some point, "I have lost all your money at Ascot. I hope you don't mind." She apparently didn't mind either. The financial structure of her life across those 49 years is documented in outline. Her civil list income reached £1.3 million per year by her later decades. Her spending consistently exceeded it. Her bank account was, by multiple accounts, chronically overdrawn. One reportedly £4 million in deficit by 1998. Elizabeth absorbed the consequences of this without documented confrontation, just as she had absorbed the 15-month delay in 1952 without issuing a direct order. The Los Angeles Times, reviewing Shawcross's biography in 2009, quoted the Queen Mother's own description of what she considered appropriate. She wrote that maintaining a regal standard required large motor cars and special trains, and all the things that are expected of the mother of the sovereign. She also, at some point, allowed the furniture in her apartments to grow so threadbare that her daughters had it secretly reupholstered with identical fabric while she was away. She noticed when she returned. She said nothing about it. The Castle of May, purchased in 1952, restored across subsequent years, maintained as a working property, remained in the Queen Mother's portfolio until she died. Birkhall, on the Balmoral estate, stayed the other anchor of her annual calendar. Both passed to Prince Charles upon her death in 2002. He moved into Clarence House the following year. He took formal possession of the home his grandmother had declared loathsome exactly half a century earlier. The Queen Mother's later influence within the family extended beyond the residential. She operated from Clarence House with the access and authority of someone who had not really left the center. Her reported involvement in Princess Margaret's relationship with the divorced group captain Peter Townsend, which became a defining family and public crisis in the mid-1950s, demonstrates the range of that influence. From Clarence House, she continued to function within the family's decision-making structure. She maintained proximity to the decisions that belonged, constitutionally, to the Queen. And Elizabeth continued to extend that proximity. The friction with Philip, meanwhile, never softened into collaboration. Multiple documentaries and biographers have described the Queen Mother as viewing Philip as dangerously progressive, someone who challenged her authority as family matriarch. The historian Jane Ridley has characterized her attitude toward him as viewing him rather an enemy. The telephone dispute was one expression of a sustained antagonism. Historian Piers Brendan, drawing on documentary material, described a tug-of-war over Charles's education. Philip wanted Gordonston, his own tough Scottish alma mater. The Queen Mother wanted Eton, just around the corner from her Windsor apartments at Royal Lodge. Charles went to Gordonston, had a miserable time, and would later describe his grandmother as the person who understood him like no other. Philip and the Queen Mother never arrived at a productive understanding. Elizabeth navigated between them for decades without formally choosing. This isn't a simple story about a calculating woman and a passive one. The letters across the whole arc of their relationship reflect genuine love on both sides. The Queen Mother's letters to her daughter describe warmth and maternal concern that run alongside every claim the record supports about her behavior in 1952. Elizabeth's later accounts of her mother, public and private, reflect genuine attachment. "We couldn't possibly do without Mummy" wasn't a mask. It was also not the whole picture. What isn't ambiguous is the sequence of events between February 1952 and May 1953. A woman with no constitutional claim to remain in Buckingham Palace remained for 15 months. The sovereign of the United Kingdom didn't order her to leave. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom eventually informed her she had to go. She went, called the next house horrible, and lived in it for 49 years. The authorized biography, 1,096 pages, drawing from personal papers and tape-recorded interviews, is described by multiple reviewers as having treated its subject with a degree of leniency. The Independent's reviewer noted that Shawcross soft pedals certain friction points and excuses her lifelong resolve to avoid unpleasantness as evidence of her optimism rather than strategic evasion. The Guardian's reviewer, Catherine Bennett, was blunter about the omissions on the Camilla scale alone. A separate critical biography identified in the research explicitly argues that both Shawcross and Vickers neglect to recount incidents that more exacting accounts would have required. The most complete picture of the 1952 standoff may still be in materials not yet publicly released or fully examined. What is in the available record? The impassioned letters, the 15-month delay, the "you would hardly know I was there," the small and horrid, the Churchill intervention, The word finally, appearing independently in multiple accounts, is consistent across sources that had no reason to coordinate on that consistency. The pattern holds. In 1953, the Queen Mother also wrote to her daughter to describe her view of her new title. "Horrible name," she put in the letter. Documented, specific, and retained in the archive that Shawcross later drew upon. She wrote it in the same year she finally moved to the house she had called Loathsome, the title she hated, the house she hated, the daughter who had let the silence do the asking rather than say the words herself. The behavioral record speaks for itself. The Queen Mother needed the palace. The palace belonged to the Queen. The Queen waited. Her mother stayed. The Prime Minister eventually delivered the message that no one with the formal authority to issue it was willing to send. She moved, called the place Loathsome, lived there happily for half a century, spent more money than she had every year, and was never once told, on the record, in a document that has survived, that any of this was a problem. Elizabeth waited for months. She didn't order. She didn't demand. She let the silence do the asking. And when silence wasn't enough, she let Churchill do the rest. And that is the single most important fact about their relationship, because it never changed. Subscribe for more stories like this one.